Type where the darkness began. If you want to know what I did, you're not allowed to dig a pond here. HOA regulations forbid any modifications that impact the community aesthetic. That was the very first thing she said as she stepped onto my family's 150-year-old ranch. For 3 days straight, she patrolled the fence lines, snapping photos, taking notes, and sending me formal warnings along with a demand: submit a renovation plan that meets community standards within 48 hours. I told her this pond dates back to 1900. This water nourished the soil my ancestors built their lives on. She smirked. This land isn't yours alone anymore. 3 days later, the streetlights went out. The irrigation systems froze. Alarms screamed across the entire HOA. I didn't dig the pond anymore. I used something they didn't know I had, and everything was swallowed by darkness. My name is Ezra Whitmore, and this story will prove that sometimes the gentlest person can be the most dangerous. This ranch has belonged to my family since 1875, when my great-grandfather bought 40 acres of Texas wasteland for $200 silver. For 6 generations, we've raised cattle, grown wheat, and lived in harmony with the land, until Constance Blackwell showed up. I'm about to tell you how a power-hungry HOA president tried to steal my land, and how I taught her a lesson by turning 847 homes into powerless stone monuments. This isn't a revenge story. This is a story about justice. And it all started with a small pond I was digging to honor my late wife. The morning it all began, I was on my knees beside the 200-year-old oak tree, my hands trembling as I worked the shovel into the rich Texas soil. This was the spot where Sarah used to lie with her books every afternoon, her auburn hair catching the light that filtered through the ancient branches. The cancer had taken her 18 months ago, but I could still hear her voice in the rustling leaves above. I want a little pond right here, you know, so I can hear the water flowing when you can't hear my voice anymore. Those were among her last coherent words, spoken on a Tuesday morning when the pain medication still allowed her moments of clarity. Now, finally, I was strong enough to honor that wish. The excavator sat silent behind me, its bright yellow paint a stark contrast against the weathered fence posts that had marked our property line since before the Civil War. I'd been working since dawn, carefully removing the topsoil by hand first, just as Sarah had taught me during her environmental engineering days at UT Austin. She always said the earth had a memory, and you had to respect what came before. The morning air carried the scent of wild bluebonnets and the distant sound of cattle from the Johnson Ranch next door. It should have been peaceful. It should have been healing. Instead, at exactly 7:03 a.m., my world shifted. I heard the crunch of gravel on my driveway. The BMW was black, pristine, and completely out of place on a working ranch. It pulled up with the confidence of someone who belonged, though I'd never seen it before in my life. The woman who emerged moved with the sharp efficiency of a corporate lawyer. Her red blazer and clipboard screamed authority in a place where authority had always meant hard work and respect for the land. She was probably in her early 50s with steel, gray hair pulled back so tightly it looked painful, and eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw as either an asset or a liability. When she spotted me kneeling by the oak tree, her entire demeanor shifted into what I can only describe as predatory focus. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice carrying across the yard with the kind of projection that suggested she was used to being heard. "Are you the property owner here?" I stood slowly, brushing dirt from my jeans, and nodded. There was something in her tone that made every instinct I'd inherited from 6 generations of Whitmores start buzzing like a rattlesnake's warning. "I'm Constance Blackwell, chairwoman of the North Creek Homeowners Association. I need to speak with you about some serious violations we've identified on this property." The way she said violations made it sound like I'd committed a federal crime instead of digging a hole in my backyard. I walked toward her, keeping my voice calm and respectful, the way my grandfather had taught me. "Ma'am, I think there might be some confusion. This land has been in my family since 1875. We're not part of any homeowners association." Her smile was thin and sharp as a blade. "I'm afraid that's where you're wrong, Mr. Whitmore. Recent changes to Texas state law have expanded HOA jurisdiction to include any property that shares boundaries or infrastructure with existing planned communities. Your ranch now falls under our authority. She pulled a tablet from her briefcase and showed me an official-looking map with our property outlined in red. As you can see, Resolution 2024-TX447 has designated this area as part of the North Creek Extended Community Zone. The words hit me like a physical blow. I'd heard rumors about HOA expanding their reach, but I'd never imagined they could simply claim property that had been in families for generations. "I'm sorry, but that can't be legal," I managed to say, though something in her expression told me she'd heard that response before. "What you're doing here," she continued, gesturing toward the excavation site, "requires environmental impact assessment, architectural review, and community approval. The aesthetic disruption alone violates 3 separate covenants. You have 48 hours to submit a complete remediation plan, or you'll face penalties of $2,000 per day until compliance is achieved." Standing there in the shadow of the oak tree, where Sarah and I had been married 35 years ago, where she dreamed of hearing water flow, I felt something I hadn't experienced since her funeral. It wasn't grief this time. It was something colder, sharper, more focused. "Ma'am, with all due respect, this pond isn't about aesthetics. It's about honoring my late wife's final wish." Constance's expression didn't soften even slightly. "Personal sentiment doesn't override community standards, Mr. Whitmore. The law is the law." She handed me a thick folder of documents and regulations, then turned back toward her BMW. "You seem like a reasonable man. I'm sure you'll do the right thing." As her car disappeared around the bend, I stood holding those papers and felt something awakening inside me, something Sarah used to call the Whitmore warrior gene. It was the same stubborn streak that had driven my ancestors to survive droughts, floods, economic crashes, and everything else Texas could throw at them. But this time was different. This time, I wasn't just a simple rancher trying to honor his wife's memory. I was a former chief electrical engineer who had designed the power grid for 3 counties. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I was remembering that every night for the past 12 years, I'd been receiving automated status reports from the system I'd built. Reports that still came to my old work email. Reports that gave me administrative access to something Constance Blackwell had no idea I controlled. When she came back with 4 lawyers, I was ready, with something she never thought I'd have. History: the convoy of black SUV pulled into my driveway at exactly 9:00 a.m., disgorging 4 attorneys in expensive suits, a notary with a briefcase full of stamps, and someone with a professional camera who immediately started documenting everything. Constance emerged from the lead vehicle wearing a navy power suit and the kind of smile that meant she thought she'd already won. "Mr. Whitmore," she announced loud enough for the camera to pick up today, "we're going to resolve this matter once and for all. I trust you've had time to review our regulations and prepare your compliance documentation." I'd spent those 2 days doing research of my own, but not the kind she expected. Instead of scrambling to meet her demands, I'd been down in the basement going through my grandfather's old filing cabinets, the ones that had sat untouched since his death 15 years ago. What I found there was going to change everything. "Ma'am, before we discuss compliance, I'd like to show you and your legal team something. Would you mind following me?" The confidence in Constance's expression flickered slightly, but she nodded to her lawyers, and they all followed me toward the house. I could see her whispering urgently to the head attorney, a thin man with silver hair who kept checking his phone like he had somewhere more important to be. The basement of our old farmhouse still smelled like my grandfather's pipe tobacco and the musty scent of decades old documents. I led them to the corner where an ancient iron safe sat, its green paint chipped and faded, but its mechanism still solid as the day it was installed in 1923. As I worked the combination, Constance tapped her foot impatiently. "Mr. Whitmore, we don't have all day for theatrical presentations. Either you have the required environmental impact study or you don't." I smiled as the safe clicked open. "Oh, I have something much better than that." From inside the safe, I pulled out a leather portfolio that hadn't seen daylight in decades. its contents protected by oiled cloth and my grandfather's meticulous care for important documents. The original land grant from 1875 was written on thick parchment in the careful script of a territorial clerk, signed by the governor of Texas himself, and bearing the official seal of the state land office. But more importantly, I had the original survey map, hand-drawn and certified by the Federal Land Survey, showing exact property boundaries that extended 20 feet beyond what even I had realized. The head attorney took the documents with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts, studying them under the basement's single bare bulb while his colleagues huddled around him. After 10 minutes of whispered consultation, he looked up at Constance with an expression I can only describe as professionally embarrassed. "Mrs. Blackwell," he said quietly, "we have a significant problem. These documents predate any HOA authority by well over a century. More importantly, the federal land grant supersedes any state-level regulatory changes. This property has what's called grandfathered status under both Texas state law and federal jurisdiction." I watched Constance's face cycle through confusion, disbelief, and finally a cold rage that made her previous authority seem almost friendly by comparison. "That's impossible," she hissed. "The new regulations apply to all properties within the designated zone. I've checked the law myself." The attorney shook his head slowly. "The law you're referencing specifically exempts properties with federal land grants predating 1900. Mr. Whitmore's family has unassailable legal standing here. But Constance Blackwell hadn't become HOA chairwoman by accepting defeat gracefully. Instead of apologizing or backing down, she did something that caught me completely off guard. She smiled, pulled out her phone, and started recording a video. "What you're witnessing here," she said to the camera, her voice taking on the tone of a concerned citizen, "is a property owner who's destroying our local environment and contaminating our groundwater supply. While Mr. Whitmore hides behind century-old paperwork, he's actively poisoning the water table that serves over 800 families in our community." She posted the video to Facebook before I could even process what was happening, and within minutes, it was being shared across local community groups with captions like "Stop the Water Poisoner" and "Protect Our Children." The backlash was swift and devastating. By that evening, the video had 75,000 views and 3,000 comments, most of them calling for everything from boycotts to criminal prosecution. My phone started ringing with calls from local businesses canceling services, neighbors demanding explanations, and reporters wanting statements about my environmental crimes. The grocery store, where I'd shopped for 20 years, suddenly couldn't find my account in their system. The mechanic who'd serviced my truck since Sarah's diagnosis claimed his shop was too busy to take new appointments. Even Dr. Martinez, who'd been our family physician for decades, had his receptionist call to say they were transitioning their patient base and could no longer provide my care. That night, sitting alone in the kitchen, Sarah and I had remodeled together just 3 years before her diagnosis. I stared at her photograph on the windowsill and felt truly isolated for the first time since her funeral. The house seemed bigger and emptier than it had even in those first terrible months after she died. But then I remembered something Sarah used to say when the cancer treatments left her feeling powerless and overwhelmed. When the world seems against you, that's when you find out what you're made of. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Marcus Torres, my former colleague at the Texas Grid Authority, and one of the few people who truly understood the system I'd designed. "Marcus," I said when he answered, "I need a favor. Can you pull a detailed report on the North Creek substation? I need to know everything about its current operational status and the land use agreements." There was a pause before he responded, and I could hear him typing in the background. "Ezra, what's going on out there? I heard some crazy rumors about HOA trouble." I gave him the short version. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Brother," he finally said, "I think you need to see what I'm looking at. That substation you're asking about, according to our records, it's been operating on your property under a lease agreement that expired 11 months ago, and nobody's renewed it." The basement suddenly felt like a war room, and I was no longer just a grieving widower trying to dig a pond in memory of his wife. I was a man who just discovered he'd been holding the keys to the kingdom all along, and nobody had bothered to ask for them back. That night, instead of grieving, I became a detective, and what I discovered about her would change the entire game. I spent the next 8 hours diving deep into public records, court filings, and newspaper archives, following digital breadcrumbs that painted a picture of Constance Black, well, I never could have imagined. What started as simple curiosity about my HOA tormentor turned into something much darker and more complex. The woman who'd been terrorizing me with legal documents and social media campaigns had her demons, and understanding them was about to become my greatest weapon. First crack in her facade came from the Austin Business Journal archives. 3 years ago, Constance had been a partner at Meridian and Associates, one of the most prestigious real estate law firms in Texas. The article announcing her departure was diplomatically worded, but the lawsuit filed 6 months later told the real story. She'd been caught altering contract language in a multimillion-dollar land deal, specifically changing environmental restrictions that would have prevented development on protected wetlands. The State Bar Association had suspended her license. The firm had fired her, and the developers had sued her personally for $2 million in damages, but the financial ruin was just the beginning of her downward spiral. Divorce records showed that her husband of 23 years had left her just 2 months after the scandal broke, taking their 2 adult children with him and citing irreconcilable differences and a breakdown of trust. The settlement had been brutal. She'd lost their $3 million home in Westlake Hills, her Mercedes, and even the small cabin in Colorado where they'd spent family vacations. By all accounts, Constance Blackwell had gone from wealthy attorney to desperate woman with nothing left to lose in just 18 months. The next morning, I was still processing everything I'd learned when old Pete Peterson knocked on my kitchen door. Pete had been our neighbor for 40 years, a retired county sheriff with the kind of institutional memory that made him invaluable when you needed to understand local politics. At 74, he still walked 3 miles every morning and kept track of everyone's business with the dedication of a professional investigator. "Ezra," he said, settling into Sarah's chair at the kitchen table, "I've been hearing some disturbing things about your new friend, Constance. Thought you might want to know what I remember about that woman." Pete's revelation was startling. She used to come around here when she was a kid, maybe 12 or 13 years old. This would have been back in the late 70s, early 80s. Her family lived in one of those little rental houses on the other side of the highway, and she'd ride her bike over here just to stand at your fence and stare at the house. Your grandfather caught her a few times, always treated her kindly, offered her lemonade and such. But there was something hungry in her eyes, like she was trying to memorize every detail of what she couldn't have. The pieces were starting to form a picture that made Constance's obsession with my property feel less like bureaucratic overreach and more like a personal vendetta wrapped in legal authority. That afternoon, Maya Chen arrived at my door with a notebook full of research that made my investigation look amateur by comparison. Maya was an investigative reporter for the Austin Chronicle who specialized in local corruption and real estate fraud. She'd been following the HOA expansion story for months. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, spreading documents across my kitchen table, "I think you're dealing with something much bigger than a simple property dispute. I've been tracking unusual HOA activity across Central Texas, and your situation fits a pattern that suggests organized fraud on a massive scale." Maya's research revealed that North Creek HOA wasn't an isolated case. In the past 3 years, 7 different HOA had used similar tactics to claim jurisdiction over previously independent properties, always targeting ranches and farms with significant development potential. The pattern was sophisticated and coordinated, involving carefully crafted legal language, strategic use of social media campaigns, and what appeared to be coordination with specific development companies. "Look at this," Maya said, pointing to a series of property transfers. Every single ranch that got absorbed by an HOA was sold within 18 months to the same development group, Sage Creek Holdings. The financial records Maya had uncovered were damning. Constance had received consulting fees totaling $347,000 from various HOA over the past 2 years, always paid through shell companies that traced back to Sage Creek Holdings. But more importantly, Maya had found the smoking gun, a proposal document outlining the North Creek Resort and Golf Community, an 800-unit luxury development planned for the exact area that included my ranch and 6 neighboring properties. The document was dated just 3 months ago and listed Constance as the community liaison and acquisition specialist. She's not just trying to stop your pond, Meyer explained. She's trying to force you off your land so she can deliver it to developers who have promised to make her rich. The HOA expansion is just the legal framework they're using to justify taking property that's been in families for generations. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't about aesthetics or environmental protection. This was about a desperate woman trying to claw her way back to wealth and status by destroying everything my family had built over 6 generations. That evening, I walked out to the oak tree where I'd been digging Sarah's pond and sat in the gathering darkness, thinking about everything I'd learned. The excavation site looked different now, not like an interruption to the landscape, but like a battle line drawn in the earth. Sarah had always believed that understanding your enemy was the first step toward victory, and now I finally understood what I was really fighting. This wasn't just about Constance Blackwell's greed, or even about my right to dig a pond. This was about whether people like her could use legal technicalities and social pressure to steal the heritage of families like mine. As I sat there in the darkness, my phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus at the power company. "Ezra, you need to see this. The lease agreement for that substation expired 11 months ago. But here's the thing. According to our automated systems, you've been receiving the monthly status reports this whole time. You've had administrative access to the North Creek grid all along. While Constance thought she was holding a deadly dagger, I was preparing the axe that could cut down the entire forest." The morning after Maya's revelations, I woke up with a clarity of purpose I hadn't felt since Sarah's final days. This wasn't just about defending my property anymore. It was about exposing a systematic fraud that was destroying families across Texas. But first, I needed to understand exactly what kind of power I was dealing with, both theirs and mine. At 7:15 a.m., I made the call that would change everything. Marcus Torres answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the kind of professional concern that told me he'd been expecting this conversation. "Ezra, I've been digging deeper into that North Creek situation like you asked," he said. "Brother, what I found is going to blow your mind." He explained that the substation serving the entire HOA development wasn't just on my property. It was completely dependent on an easement agreement that had never been properly renewed. According to Texas utility law, when a land lease expires without renewal, the property owner has the right to request immediate cessation of operations with just 4 hours' notice. The power company had sent 17 renewal notices over the past 11 months, and nobody had responded. The legal foundation was even more solid than I'd hoped. Marcus walked me through the documentation that proved beyond any doubt that I owned the land, the easement had expired, and the power company had been operating illegally on my property for almost a year. "Here's the thing that's going to interest you," Marcus continued. "Remember that automated monitoring system you designed, the one that sends nightly status reports. You're still listed as the primary contact and emergency coordinator. Technically, you have more administrative authority over that substation than anyone at the power company except the regional director." While I was processing this information, my phone started ringing with calls from neighbors, reporters, and even strangers who'd seen Constance's viral video. Most were hostile, but a few were beginning to ask questions that suggested the tide of public opinion might be starting to turn. Mrs. Henderson from the general store called to apologize for the way her staff had treated me. "Ezra, I've known your family for 30 years, and something about this whole situation doesn't smell right. That woman's been asking too many questions about property values and development potential for someone who's supposedly just worried about water quality." By noon, Constance had escalated to her next level of desperation. She arrived at the courthouse with what appeared to be a prepared emergency motion. seeking a temporary restraining order to protect the community's environmental and safety interests. But Maya had been monitoring the court filings, and what she found in the supporting documents was explosive. "Ezra, you need to see this," she said, spreading papers across my kitchen table. The environmental study Constance submitted to support her restraining order was fabricated. I cross-referenced the soil samples and water testing data with the state environmental database. The tests she claims were conducted on your property were done 3 counties away, and the contamination levels she's citing don't match anything in the geological survey for this area. The falsified evidence was just the beginning. Maya had also discovered that Judge Miller, who was scheduled to hear Constance's emergency motion, had received a significant campaign contribution from a political action committee that traced directly back to Sage Creek Holdings. "It gets worse," Maya continued. "I found bank records showing an $80,000 deposit into an account belonging to Judge Miller's daughter, made just 2 days after Constance filed her motion. The money came from a consulting company that exists only on paper and shares an address with Sage Creek's headquarters." That evening, as I prepared for what I knew would be the final confrontation, I found myself working with a methodical calm that reminded me of the old days when I was troubleshooting complex electrical systems. I installed a Tesla Powerwall battery system that would keep my ranch running independently for at least 72 hours. I set up 6 high-definition security cameras around the property, all connected to a cloud storage system that would preserve evidence even if the equipment was damaged. Maya helped me configure a professional live streaming setup that could broadcast to thousands of viewers simultaneously, but the most important preparation was psychological. I spent an hour that night sitting by Sarah's grave talking to her about what I was planning to do. "I'm going to do something that might seem cruel, but it's the only way to stop them from hurting other families the way they've tried to hurt us. You always said that sometimes you have to create a little darkness to protect the light." The oak tree above her headstone rustled in the evening breeze, and for a moment I could almost hear her voice telling me she understood. Constance called me at 10:47 p.m., her voice shaking with what sounded like a mixture of rage and desperation. "Mr. Whitmore, I want you to know that tomorrow morning I'll have a court order authorizing your arrest if you don't immediately cease all excavation activities. I've also arranged for Child Protective Services to investigate whether your environmental violations pose a danger to children in community. You have one last chance to do this the easy way." Her threats felt hollow now that I understood the scope of her fraud, but they also confirmed that she was preparing for a final desperate gamble. After hanging up, I sat in my darkened kitchen and composed the email that would end this war. Subject: Notice of lease termination and cessation of electrical operations effective 9:35 a.m. tomorrow. All electrical service provided via the North Creek substation, located on Whitmore Ranch property, must cease immediately. This notice is provided by Texas Utilities Code Section 181.082 and constitutes formal termination of expired land use agreements. I scheduled the email to send at 3:22 a.m., giving the power company exactly 6 hours and 13 minutes to prepare for what was about to happen. Then I went to bed and slept like a baby, knowing that in less than 10 hours, Constance Blackwell's empire of lies was going to crumble into darkness. 9:30 a.m., Constance arrived with her army. 9:35 a.m., 847 homes fell into complete electronic darkness. The morning I'd been preparing for arrived with the kind of crystal clarity that Texas skies delivered just before a storm. I was sitting on my front porch, coffee in hand, watching the sunrise paint the oak tree gold when the convoy appeared on the horizon. Constance had outdone herself this time, bringing what looked like a small invasion force to deal with one man and his pond. The procession that pulled into my driveway at exactly 9:28 a.m. was designed for maximum intimidation. Constance led in her black BMW, followed by 2 police cruisers with officers who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. A white van from Channel 7 News and 3 chartered buses disgorged nearly 80 angry HOA residents. Behind them came an ambulance, which struck me as either overly cautious or ominously prophetic. The woman who stepped out of the BMW bore little resemblance to the composed attorney who'd first visited my property. Her hair was disheveled, her makeup slightly smeared, and her hands shook as she gripped a megaphone like it was a weapon. Ezra Whitmore, her amplified voice cracked across the morning air. "You are violating a court order issued by Judge Miller at 6:00 a.m. this morning. You have 30 seconds to cease all excavation activities and surrender yourself to law enforcement, or you will be arrested for contempt of court, environmental terrorism, and endangering public safety." The crowd behind her took up the chant, "Arrest the water poisoner, protect our children." Their voices carried a genuine fear that made me almost feel sorry for how thoroughly Constance had manipulated them. I stood slowly, setting my coffee cup on the porch rail, and walked toward the assembled mob with the kind of calm that comes from knowing you hold all the cards. In my hand was a single sheet of paper that represented the culmination of everything I'd learned over the past week. "Officer Martinez," I said, addressing the lead policeman who'd gone to high school with my nephew, "before anyone gets arrested, I think you should take a look at this." I handed him the document that Marcus had helped me prepare, a formal notice of lease termination, stamped and certified by the Texas Power Authority, giving me the legal right to immediately cease all electrical operations on my property. Officer Martinez read the document twice, his expression shifting from confusion to amazement to something approaching respect. "Mrs. Blackwell," he said, turning to Constance, "this appears to be a legitimate order from the State Utility Commission. Mr. Whitmore has the legal authority to terminate electrical service to any equipment operating on his land." Constance snatched the paper from his hands, her face cycling through disbelief, rage, and finally a desperate kind of panic. "This is impossible. You can't just cut power to an entire community. There are families with medical equipment, children who need air conditioning, ma'am," I said, my voice carrying the quiet authority I'd learned from 30 years of managing electrical emergencies. "You wanted to play legal games with my property. Now you get to learn what real property rights look like." I pulled out my phone and dialed the number I'd memorized 3 days ago. "This is Ezra Whitmore, authorization code Sierra 77 Alpha. I'm requesting immediate cessation of electrical service to the North Creek substation per my formal notice dated this morning, effective immediately." The response was almost instantaneous. Marcus had warned me it would be dramatic, but nothing could have prepared me for the reality of watching an entire community's electrical infrastructure die in real time. At exactly 9:35 a.m., a sound like a massive circuit breaker echoed across the landscape as the North Creek substation shut down with a finality that seemed to suck the air out of the morning. Then came the cascading failures, streetlights flickering and dying, the distant wail of security alarms as backup batteries kicked in, the grinding halt of irrigation pumps that had been watering lawns and gardens. Within 60 seconds, the full scope of what I'd done became apparent. Garage doors throughout the HOA development were frozen shut, trapping cars and their owners in a mechanical standstill. Air conditioning units that had been battling the already rising Texas heat fell silent, leaving 847 homes to face what the Weather Service had predicted would be a 104-degree day. Swimming pool pumps stopped circulating water that would soon become stagnant, breeding grounds for mosquitoes. Security systems defaulted to battery power that would last maybe 6 hours before leaving the entire community vulnerable. Constance's reaction was primal and immediate. She screamed into her megaphone with a voice that cracked from strain. "You're a terrorist. You're killing people. Children will die because of what you've done." But her panic was nothing compared to the chaos erupting behind her as HOA residents began to grasp the implications of their powerless homes. Cell phone service became spotty as the local tower struggled without its primary power source. Car charging stations went dead. Even the traffic lights at the main intersection began flashing red as their backup systems engaged. Meanwhile, my ranch hummed along peacefully on its Tesla Powerwall system. The air conditioning kept my house comfortable. The water pumps continued drawing from our well, and the security cameras captured every moment of the unfolding drama. I returned to my porch chair, picked up my coffee, and watched Constance frantically calling numbers on her phone, each conversation more frustrating than the last. The power company says they can't override a property owner's termination order. I heard her shouting. What do you mean there's nothing you can do? The crowd that had arrived so confident and unified began to fragment as the reality of their situation sank in. Parents with young children started heading back to their buses, worried about the heat building in their powerless homes. Elderly residents complained about medical equipment that needed electricity. Business owners realized their home offices were now completely non-functional. The righteous anger they'd felt toward me was rapidly being redirected toward the woman who'd led them into this disaster. "This isn't over, Whitmore," Constance screamed across the yard as her supporters abandoned her. "I have resources you can't imagine. I'll destroy you for this." But her threats felt hollow now, delivered from the middle of the electronic wasteland she'd unknowingly helped me create. As the buses departed with their loads of sweating, frustrated residents, I sat in my air-conditioned comfort and prepared for the afternoon show that would make this morning's chaos look like a gentle warm-up, because the real performance was still hours away. 4:00 p.m. When 500 people descended on my ranch like an angry mob, they had no idea they were about to witness the final chapter of a massive fraud empire. The afternoon heat had turned the powerless HOA community into a furnace of frustration and desperation. What started as scattered complaints about air conditioning had evolved into a full-scale revolt against the woman who'd promised to protect their interests. By the time the convoy of overheated cars, pickup trucks, and SUV rolled up my driveway, Constance was no longer leading a supportive community. She was being hunted by 500 people who'd spent 6 hours sweating in 104-degree heat while watching their frozen garage doors trap their cars and the spoiled food rot in powerless refrigerators. Maya Chen had been preparing for this moment since dawn, setting up 4 different camera angles around my property and configuring a professional live stream that was already drawing viewers from across Texas. The Facebook feed went live at 3:45 p.m. with a simple title, HOA Chairwoman Exposed, The Truth Behind the North Creek Power Outage. Within 15 minutes, we had 12,000 viewers watching in real time, and the number was climbing exponentially as word spread through social media. Maya positioned herself near the oak tree with a wireless microphone, ready to capture every word of what was about to unfold. I stepped onto my porch carrying a laptop, a portable projector, and a speaker system powerful enough to address a crowd of hundreds. Behind me, my house hummed with electricity, while the community beyond my fence line sweltered in powerless misery. The contrast was intentional and dramatic. The crowd that faced me was no longer the organized group that had arrived that morning. These were desperate people who'd been betrayed, and they were beginning to understand that their real enemy wasn't the man who'd cut their power, but the woman who'd led them into this disaster. "Ladies and gentlemen," I called out, my voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd, "you came here this morning because Constance Blackwell told you I was poisoning your water and destroying your community. Before anyone else gets hurt by her lies, I think you deserve to know the truth about who she really is, and what she's been doing to your families." I connected the projector to my laptop and aimed it at a large white sheet Maya had hung between 2 fence posts. The first image that appeared was a blown-up photograph of a legal document with Constance's signature visible. "This is a contract between Constance Blackwell and Sage Creek Holdings dated 3 months ago," I announced as murmurs began rippling through the crowd. "It outlines her payment schedule for acquiring ranch properties that will be demolished to make room for an 800-unit luxury resort development. The compensation she's promised for your neighborhood alone is $1.2 million. The crowd's murmur turned into angry shouts as people began to understand the scope of the deception. "Your chairwoman hasn't been protecting your community. She's been selling it." Maya stepped forward with her microphone, addressing the live stream audience. "What you're seeing here is documentation of a systematic fraud that's been targeting Texas ranching families for over 2 years. Mr. Whitmore isn't the first victim of this scheme, and he won't be the last unless we expose it right here, right now." The viewer count on the livestream had climbed to over 18,000, with comments flooding in from people across the state who recognized similar patterns in their communities. Local news stations were beginning to pick up the feed and rebroadcast it to their television audiences. The next documents I displayed were bank records showing the $347,000 in consulting fees Constance had received from shell companies connected to Sage Creek Holdings. But the smoking gun was the audio recording Maya had obtained through her investigative contacts. A phone conversation between Constance and a Sage Creek executive discussing the timeline for clearing the remaining properties and the final phase of community integration. When Constance's voice came through the speaker, saying, "Once we eliminate the Whitmore problem, we'll have a clear path to the entire development zone," the crowd's anger reached a boiling point. Constance, who had been standing near her BMW looking increasingly panicked throughout my presentation, finally snapped under the pressure of 500 pairs of hostile eyes and 180,000 livestream viewers watching her world collapse. "All right," she screamed into Maya's microphone, her voice breaking with desperation and exhaustion. "Yes, I took the money. Yes, I lied to all of you, but I lost everything. My house, my marriage, my career. I needed those development fees to survive. I never meant for anyone to get hurt." Her confession sent shockwaves through the crowd and the livestream audience, but before anyone could fully process what they just heard, 8 black SUVs appeared simultaneously from different directions, surrounding the property with the precision of a military operation. FBI agents in tactical gear emerged from the vehicles, led by Special Agent Sarah Mitchell, who approached Constance with handcuffs already in hand. "Constance Blackwell, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, racketeering, money laundering, and bribery of public officials. You have the right to remain silent." Maya stepped closer to the camera, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around her. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you've just witnessed is the result of a 2-week federal investigation that began when Mr. Whitmore contacted authorities about irregularities in local HOA activities. The FBI has been monitoring this situation since last Tuesday, waiting for enough evidence to move against the entire conspiracy. The revelation that I'd been working with federal agents all along sent another wave of shock through the crowd and the online audience. As handcuffs clicked around Constance's wrists, the woman who had terrorized my family and dozens of others finally broke completely, tears streaming down her face. She looked directly into Maya's camera and said, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry to everyone I hurt. I just wanted my life back." The crowd that had arrived ready to lynch me was now staring in stunned silence as their former leader was loaded into an FBI vehicle, her empire of lies crumbling in real time before a livestream audience that had grown to over 25,000 viewers. With one phone call to Marcus Torres, I restored power to the entire North Creek community. As air conditioners hummed back to life and garage doors opened to release trapped cars, the crowd that had come to destroy me began to cheer. Someone shouted, "He saved us from the real criminal," and suddenly I was surrounded by people apologizing, shaking my hand, and asking how they could help rebuild what Constance had tried to tear down. But even as the celebration began, I knew the most important part of this story was still waiting to be told. 2 years later, when the pond was finally completed, I revealed the final secret that Sarah had left behind, something that would change forever how we lived. The transformation of North Creek from an oppressive HOA community into something unprecedented had been gradual but profound. What emerged from the ashes of Constance's fraud was the first truly self-governing neighborhood cooperative in Texas, a model that other communities across the state were already beginning to study and replicate. The 847 families who had once lived under the thumb of arbitrary regulations now governed themselves through consensus and mutual respect, proving that people could coexist beautifully without authoritarian oversight. My election as community coordinator had been unanimous. Though I'd initially resisted the role, the irony wasn't lost on me that the man they'd once tried to arrest was now the person they trusted most to guide their future. But what made our success possible wasn't my leadership. It was the discovery of what Sarah had been planning during those final months. when cancer was stealing her strength but couldn't touch her brilliant mind. The pond I'd been digging in her memory wasn't just a tribute to our love story. It was the centerpiece of an environmental restoration system so sophisticated that MIT was sending graduate students to study it. The revelation came during the pond's dedication ceremony, 18 months after Constance's arrest. As I stood before the gathered community beside the crystal, clear water that now reflected the ancient oak's branches, I felt Sarah's presence so strongly it took my breath away. Most of you knew my wife as a kind neighbor and a woman who loved this land. I began, my voice carrying across the crowd of families who had become closer than blood relatives through our shared struggle. What you didn't know is that Sarah Whitmore held 3 degrees from MIT in environmental engineering, hydrology, and sustainable systems design. And in the last year of her life, while she was fighting cancer, she was also designing something extraordinary. The technical specifications would have impressed any engineering professor, but the practical results spoke for themselves. Sarah's pond was the heart of a natural water filtration system that served the entire community of 2,000 people using 47 species of carefully selected aquatic plants to remove contaminants from groundwater that had been polluted by decades of agricultural runoff. The system generated enough clean water to eliminate our dependence on the municipal supply, saving every family an average of $400 per month on utility bills. More remarkably, the biological processes Sarah had engineered improved water quality beyond what it had been before human settlement, creating the first carbon-negative residential community in Texas history. Maya Chen, who had become not just our unofficial historian, but one of my closest friends, documented the environmental miracle for her book, The Pond That Saved a Community. Her research revealed that Sarah's system was attracting wildlife that hadn't been seen in Central Texas for over 50 years. The pond now hosted 200 species of migratory birds, 50 varieties of native fish, and an ecosystem so robust that environmental scientists from around the world were requesting permission to study it. Children who had grown up thinking nature meant manicured lawns and chemically treated landscapes were now learning to identify bird calls and understand how clean water traveled from earth to sky and back again. The transformation extended far beyond environmental benefits. Our community had become a model for conflict resolution, cooperative governance, and economic sustainability that was being studied by urban planners and sociologists. The Sage Creek Holdings development that would have destroyed 12 family ranches had been permanently blocked by federal environmental protections, and the land was being converted into a state nature preserve. Property values in our area had increased by 35% as people sought to join a community that proved you could live better by working together rather than fighting each other. But perhaps the most meaningful change was what happened to Constance Blackwell herself. After serving 18 months in federal prison, she had written me a letter that Maya read aloud during our second annual community celebration. Mr. Whitmore. The letter began, I spent my entire adult life believing that power meant taking what I wanted from other people. Losing everything taught me that real power comes from helping others build what they need. I know I can never undo the harm I caused, but I want you to know that seeing what your community has accomplished has given me hope that people can change. Thank you for showing me a better way to live. I had visited Constance during her final month in prison, not to gloat or seek an apology, but because Sarah had always taught me that everyone deserves the chance for redemption. The broken woman I met there bore no resemblance to the predator who had tried to steal my land. She was volunteering to teach basic legal literacy to other inmates, helping them understand their rights and avoid the kind of desperation that had driven her to crime. When she was released, our community voted unanimously to offer her a job as our legal compliance coordinator, ensuring that we would never again fall victim to the kind of regulatory manipulation she had once mastered. Every morning, I still sit beside Sarah's pond with my coffee, listening to the gentle sound of water flowing over the rocks she had specified in her final designs. The surface reflects not just the oak tree's ancient branches, but the faces of children who come here every afternoon to learn about the natural world their parents had almost lost. Sarah's engineering has given us clean water, clean air, and a clean conscience about how we treat the earth and each other. But her greatest gift was teaching me that sometimes, to protect the light, you have to be willing to create temporary darkness. The pond ripples gently in the morning breeze, and I can almost hear her voice in the sound. The darkness has passed, my love. The light is home to stay forever. Whether it's a bullying HOA, an unfair boss, or someone who thinks they can push us around, we've all felt that crushing weight of powerlessness. Ezra's story reminds us that the quiet ones often possess the most unexpected strength. If this resonated with you, share your own story in the comments below. Have you ever had to stand up to someone who thought they could walk all over you? Here at HOA Stories, we believe good people can win against impossible odds. If you enjoyed this, hit that like button and subscribe. And if this story moved you, a small donation would help us keep telling stories where love and wisdom triumph. Because sometimes the person who looks most defeated is holding all the power.